The story elements analysis stratagem is used during the reading of the story. We recommend that initially you read the story aloud to students as they read along. Now, later on, as we move into this module, students will be reading the story to themselves or with each other. But initially, we suggest that you read it aloud as students read along. There are two primary instructional resources that we'll be looking at during this video. The first is the Story Elements Analysis DVT, and then we also have a formative assessment DVT that focuses on understanding story elements. The key core standards that this stratagem addresses, one of them is basically analyzing what the text says explicitly as well as inferences drawn from the text. We'll also be doing some character analysis. For an example, how complex characters develop over the course of the text, interact with other characters, advance the plot, and develop the theme. We'll also be looking at how the author structured the text to create effects like mystery, tension, or surprise, as well as the orders of events and manipulates time and so forth. And we'll also be practicing drawing evidence from literary text to support analysis, reflection, and research. I'm going to take a moment to introduce the Story Elements Analysis DVT. The first thing we'll be looking at is what we call the character setup. And so we're looking for explicit information provided at the beginning of the story about the character. So for an example, early in Most Dangerous Game, Rainsford is introduced. And so we're listing some things that the author provides about Rainsford, such as that he's a hunter, he doesn't care about the animals he kills, he thinks the world's made up of two classes of people, the hunters and the hunted, and he doesn't panic when he falls off the boat. In addition, we're going to use those story clues that are provided by the author to also draw some inferences about the character or pose a question about the character, like question I'm asking, or form a prediction about the character. An example would be from the story clues, an inference about Rainsford is that he's condescending when he makes fun of his friend's beliefs. And I can also form a prediction about Rainsford. For an example, I predict that something bad is going to happen concerning the islands that the sailors think is evil. We're also going to look at the setting setup. In other words, again, we're looking for explicit information provided by the author about the setting. And then we'll also be using those clues to form an inference or pose a question or a prediction about the setting. And we'll also look at the situation or the scene setup, which of course is similar but somewhat different from the setting. We're dealing more with the situation or the context in which the story is taking place. So what we're looking for here is explicit information that was revealed in the beginning of the story about the situation where the story begins. And again, we'll be forming inferences, predictions, or asking questions about that. And then we'll start moving into the unfolding conflict. So here we're going to identify what was the first sign of conflict that begins to show up in the story. And then as we move on to page 2 of this, we're going to identify more unfolding conflict. And so essentially we're looking for explicit information that made the conflict grow or become more suspenseful, and then additional information. And finally, the climax, what was the highest point of the suspense. Then we're going to identify what was the tipping point. In other words, what caused the conflict to begin moving towards the resolution. And then last, what was the resolution? How was the conflict resolved? So here's how we suggest using that DVT as the story is analyzed. The first thing we recommend is, before you even begin reading the story, is introduce students to the DVD itself and discuss the prompts and basically explain how the DVT is going to work. And then, as the story is being read, what you'll be implementing is basically a text to notes to elaboration procedure. So initially we're going to look at text to notes. So what we recommend is that initially you read the story to students as they read along and then provide guided note-taking on the DVT. So you'll be reading a portion of the story and then stopping, talking about what the story revealed, forming inferences, questions, and predictions, and so forth. As you're scaffolding, we suggest you is initially read, discuss the ideas, and then you model note-taking on the DVT. So you show students what the notes look like, and so students will initially be basically copying your notes, but then you'll move towards reading and discussing the idea and then co-constructing the notes. So at this point, you'll be drawing ideas from the students in terms of what were things that they noticed about explicit information the story revealed about the author or the setting or the conflict and so forth, and discussing that, and then have them tell you what should be noted on the DVT. And of course, you may modify that and tweak it a little bit, but basically you are writing the notes, but they're helping you construct the ideas that should be noted on it. So the other part of this is also important, is to model and prompt the use of those text clues for asking questions, drawing inferences, and making predictions. The other component of scaffolding is also, in addition to identifying explicit information the author provided about the author and the setting and the conflict and so forth, it's also important to scaffold, meaning to model and prompt the use of text clues in order to ask questions, draw inferences, and make predictions. So likewise, you'll be modeling and thinking out loud to show students what the thinking looks like when you're formulating questions about the character or the setting of the conflict, or modeling the drawing inferences and making predictions. And then fairly quickly shift to having students work with you to co-construct those questions, inferences, or predictions, and then facilitating note-taking of those. Later, after the DVT has been completed, we'll be shifting from the text to notes phase of instruction to the notes to elaboration phase of instruction. Students will be using the completed DVT as a guide as they practice verbally explaining the unfolding conflict and resolution. This activity is really important because not only does it develop fluency in terms of their ability to retell the story in their own language, but it also lays the groundwork for using DVT notes as a basis for composing expository essays or argumentative essays. In addition to practicing retelling the story to develop fluency, we also want them to discuss the various questions and inferences and predictions they drew as the story unfolded, as well as whether those questions were answered, whether the predictions turned out to be true, and so forth. For formative assessment, we'll be using the Understanding Story Elements DVT. The purpose is basically to answer these questions. Do students understand story structure? And what do they understand about key story elements? This is the Understanding Story Elements assessment. So example questions include, like, what was the purpose of the Story Elements DVT? What is a character setup, and what kind of information from the text would you look for to list here? What's the difference between a setting setup and a situation or scene setup? What's the difference between a climax and a tipping point? And what is a resolution, and what kind of information would you look for to list here? And finally, describe the structure or pattern that authors usually follow when writing a story. Included in the Stratagem resources is an example of how responses might look with this formative assessment. Finally, we'll end this stratagem by asking students to turn and talk about these essential questions. Now, there are a couple of them, so you can choose to either provide one or the other, or both, and have students choose which one to respond to. So the first essential question is, how could the Story Elements Analysis DVT be used if you were asked to write a report about this story? This DVT not only required you to note summaries of key information, but also to use the text clues to draw inferences, form predictions, or ask questions. So why is it important to use thinking strategies like these when reading?